Hi, and welcome to everyone. My name is Annika, and I work for an organization called the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform. I'm the manager of a community of practice on environment, climate, conflict, and peace. And this community of practice has come together over the past year to form a sort of participatory collective of individuals who are collaborating to put peace on the map, to mainstream awareness of peace at COP28. This webinar installment is a part of our Peace Primers for Peace at COP28 series. Katie has kindly put the link in the chat. It's mostly bi-weekly. There's a couple of odd Thursdays in there. Bi-weekly webinar series that explores different topics related to peace at COP28. You'll see we are recording this session. Have already had nearly 100 views on the first installment a couple of weeks ago, and we'll be sharing this widely. We are only recording the speaker view, not the gallery view, so do feel free to turn on your camera if you'd like to. It won't be recorded. And otherwise, please just make sure that you stay on mute so that our speakers really get the space to take the floor and make their points. I am going to hand it over to the hosts today, WILP, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and especially to Michelle. Michelle is a feminist peace activist and intersectional environmentalist. As a consultant for WILP's environmental working group, she works to put the issue of sustainable peace and demilitarization on the COP agenda. There's truly no one better suited to kick us off. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you so much, Annika, and welcome everyone to our meeting today titled Addressing the Root Causes, Taking Action on Military Spending and Emissions to Advance Climate, Gender Justice, and Peace. Yes, also a warm welcome from my side, and of course, like the team that is behind the scenes to organize this event. Today, we really pose the question of why is militarization one of the biggest obstacles to mitigating the climate crisis? And in this webinar, WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, will demonstrate the connections between military spending and emissions and the climate crisis from an intersectional and feminist perspective in order to truly advance sustainable peace and also a peaceful planet. So for those of you who might not be so familiar with WILF, as I said, the abbreviation stands for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And WILF is a global organization of women peace builders, which has worked over decades now, over more than 100 years on tackling the root causes of war. And also in that context, demilitarization has been one of our key demands. And the speakers today, they're all part of the WILF Environment Working Group, which particularly addresses the links between military impacts and the climate crisis. And that's also why we're here today, to bring these issues together and bring that also closer to your understanding. So today we will hear from including myself, 4 speakers. The agenda looks as follows. So I will kick us off with an overview of the militarization of the climate crisis. And then I will hand over to Katrin for a more detailed analysis. Afterwards, we have Edric from WILF Zimbabwe, who will talk about the nexus of conflict, militarism, and the ecological crisis. And then Ola will talk as well about the impact of militarization of the climate crisis in the context of Yemen. Feel free to post any questions that you might have during our inputs into the chat. We do want to take some time to really provide you with an input, but there will be also a Q&A session later on at our webinar. So I would like to ask Annika perhaps to share the screen. Perfect, thank you so much. So to provide us all with some context for our discussion today, I will start with a concise overview of why the topic of demilitarization holds significant importance within the realm of sustainable peace and also climate justice in the context of peace building. I really tried to keep my comments brief given the time constraints that we have, but I want to introduce some fundamental concepts so that I can afterwards also hand over to Katrin for a more comprehensive analysis. I will particularly center our attention on four main aspects: on the impacts of military emissions, military spending, the effects on ecosystems and carbon sinks, as well as the increased threats faced by environmental defenders and also those most impacted by the climate crisis. Before really going and delving into these four different aspects, I think it would be important for us to talk about what does militarization even mean, because it's such a loaded term. I think it's important to kind of define. So according to Cynthia Enloe, militarization is a step-by-step process by which a person or a thing gradually becomes to be controlled by the military or comes to depend for its well-being on militaristic ideas. What does this all contain? So as a result, the military and weapons are often seen as something indispensable. It's an idea which implies that the use of collective violence and also of militaristic activities provides an adequate solution to solve multiple crises that we are facing currently. And one of them is, for example, the climate crisis. And really also kind of justifies the military as an actor to respond to climate-induced conflicts. Militarization can be witnessed in the form of increasing security budgets, but also allocation of funding to the military and militarist activities, for example, the securitization of borders. Now that we've talked a little bit about the term, there are four main ways in which the process of militarization is driving the ecological crisis. Next slide, please. So these are the four aspects I want to address with you today. We can already go to the next slide, please, and talk about military emissions. So recent studies suggest that militaries are responsible for 5.5% of global emissions. Let's hear this again. It's 5.5 of our global emissions worldwide. To put this into perspective, so the global emissions of the civilian aviation industry is half of that. That means around 2.5%. If we were to combine all of the world's militaries, they would be the fourth largest national emitter behind China and the US and India. Let's, for example, look at the US military, one of the biggest emitters. Dr. Nita Crawford has found that most US military emissions arise from their use of aircraft, actually. And the US Air Force is the largest user of fossil fuel energy in the US federal government, consuming more than 2 billion gallons of jet fuel per year, and accounts for around 10% of total US aviation fuel use. Catherine will also delve into these aspects a little bit more later. It's just like an example to give a little more context. So in addition to the emissions that we just mentioned of military activity, there are also emissions from active conflict. Sorry, I'm just going to pause. So to take the example, for instance, of the war in Ukraine, there are recent estimations that calculate that the first year of the war has triggered an increase of emissions that amount to the annual output of the emissions of a country like Belgium. This is just one example of all the different conflicts that we have on this, on our planet, and we will hear a little bit more about conflict context as well later from our other speakers. So the huge problem within the UNFCCC is that the signatories are obliged to publish their annual greenhouse gas emissions, but military emissions reporting is voluntary. So basically, we always talk about transparency and accountability, but when it comes to military emissions, that's not the case. According to the military emissions gap data set, the US has a very significant gap in reporting military emissions. And out of the 27 European countries, we also have 11 who have a significant gap. Let's link this aspect of military emissions now to military spending. Next slide, please. So there is actually a correlation between an increase in military spending and an increase in emissions. In other words, the higher the military expenditure, the higher the emissions. So last year, global military emissions rose to an all-time record high of 2.24 trillion trillion dollars. But why is it even an issue that we have such a high spending? So every single dollar of those 2.24 trillion spent on the military actually diverts resources away from tackling the climate crisis. According to a report from the Transnational Institute between 2013 and 2021, the world's wealthiest nations were spending 30 times more on military power than on tackling the climate crisis. So those wealthiest countries who are also the most responsible for the climate crisis, for example, the G20, actually account for the vast majority of these military spendings at around 87%. But at the same time, as we are aware that they're spending so much on militaries, we also know that exactly those states are kind of not fulfilling their responsibility to keep their promise of providing the $100 billion per year of climate finance, particularly for low-income countries. What this means, in other words, is that the wealthiest countries currently waste an extensive amount of money on militaries instead of providing a fraction of these resources for conflict-sensitive and gender-transformative climate action. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about military emissions and military spending, let's look at the destruction of ecosystems and carbon sinks and also the impacts on those most impacted by the climate crisis. So military exercises and weapons testing, as well as weapons use and conflict at the same time, all destroy our ecosystem and our carbon sinks, including having impacts on deforestation, loss of biodiversity, pollution of water, soil, and air. It's crucial for us to understand that the environmental damage caused by military exercises and weapons testing during peacetime, so when there's actually no war, is higher actually than the wartime itself. So it exceeds those emissions and the destruction in the wartime. Military training areas all around the world cover 5 to 6% of the global land surface, which is roughly the same land surface of the US. And so the destruction of active conflict, but also of military exercises and trainings that happen during so-called peacetime, for instance, the Rim of the Pacific exercise, the world's largest international maritime warfare exercise held biannually in Honolulu, Hawaii, really has a large impact on our fragile land, on the oceans and the airspace. And it really very much also exacerbates the environmental destruction. Next slide, please. So besides these impacts on our environment and our planet, there is also a large impact of militarization on those who are already most impacted by the climate crisis, and as well those who are defending the environment. So in other words, the militarization of the climate and ecological crisis places a heavier burden on those who are already experiencing the most severe effects. Militaries are often used to protect extractive industries and criminalize environmental defenders, oftentimes also encouraged by global North countries to protect their investments in so-called global South countries. Militarization is also connected to militarized narratives, for instance, against climate refugees, most of them are coming from the global South. And while those are portrayed as a security threat in a kind of us versus them logic, they have contributed to least to the climate crisis. That also becomes visible when we talk about funding and spending. For instance, the investment in border security have experienced substantial growth. And according to a report by the TNI in 2021, the spending on border security by the 7 largest greenhouse gas emitters increased by 29% from 2013 to 2018. When we look at the US particularly, the spending on border and immigration enforcement between the years of 2003 and 2021 actually tripled. And when we look at the European Union and their border agency Frontex, the amount of budget allocation actually also skyrocketed to about 2.7%. But we will listen to more impacts on those most affected by the climate crisis a little bit later on as Edwig and Ola speak. So just to conclude, these militarized approaches are not able to really address the root causes of the climate crisis, such as the extractive and capitalist imperialist systems, but on the opposite, actually serve, and militarization serves to uphold these very systems. And in order to dive a little bit deeper, I want to hand over to Katrin, who's gonna give us a little bit more background on questions like, for example, why the military can't be really green. And so, over to you, Katrin.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. So now that you've listened to Michelle's overview of how militarization and the ecological crisis are linked, I'd like to address two main concerns that we often hear when we talk about this issue. And when we call, based on the evidence that Michelle has presented, when we call based on that for demilitarization for climate justice. Next slide, please, Annika. So one argument that we hear is, that we don't really have to demilitarize, but that it's going to be enough to decarbonize the military. And the other argument is that it's unrealistic for states to reduce their military spending in a world that appears increasingly insecure. And so in the short time that I have available, I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into these two aspects and the doubts and concerns that we've come across when we're calling for demilitarization for climate justice. So let's start with the first question. Can the military just be green? And I'd just like to begin with a really quick analysis of how realistic it really is for militaries to be able to decarbonize at the speed and the urgency which would be required to meaningfully mitigate the climate crisis. And so one of the problems is that militaries across the world count on fossil fuel powered fighter jets, such as the F-35, to be a part of their military arsenal for decades to come. For example, the US is currently planning on buying close to 2,500 new F-35, with the expectation that they'll fly until at least 2070. While other countries such as Norway, Switzerland, or Germany have also made procurements for the F-35. And I think this really begs the question, how come that governments are wasting billions of dollars on fossil fuel fighter jets, fossil fuel powered fighter jets that are planned on being used for the next 5 decades, when they should, decarbonize as quickly as possible. Another problem is that there's currently no comparable alternative to energy-dense jet fuel. And thank you. And the NGO Safe Landing, which is an NGO by aviation workers, including aerospace engineers, have shared detailed research and evidence that there simply is no available technology to decarbonize planes within the time frame that is required to stay within 1.5 or even 2 degrees warming. And in their analysis, they debunk, each of the supposed alternatives to fuels such as biofuels, electric flights, or carbon offsetting. And I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into the details as to why these aren't viable options, but I encourage you to check out their research if you want to learn more. And I'm just going to quickly paste the link in the chat. Okay, but even if militaries were able to decarbonize completely, it would still not be enough to address today's most pressing issues. Militaries would still consume vast resources and thereby contributing to the ecological crisis. In particular, we know of the huge environmental, human rights, as well as conflict risks related to the mining of minerals that would be required for such a green military. And obviously, all sectors in society have to grapple with the resource challenge of the renewable energy transition. But militaries have a unique responsibility precisely because of their highly energy-intensive operations and their disproportionate energy demands compared to other sectors. And so even if it was possible to simply, switch to renewable energy, it would still mean the vast consumption of finite metals, minerals, and other resources. And even if the military were completely green, it would still mean that it would use excessive amounts of financial resources. And this leads me to my second point, and that is the issue of military spending. And as we've heard from Michelle earlier, there is a correlation between increased military spending and increased greenhouse gas emissions. So let me first address the conventional arguments around the need to increase military spending, which are that, some states argue that military spending is required in the context of an ever more insecure world. And I think this argument begs the question, what actually are the root causes of this insecure world? And isn't every country that is increasing its military spending contributing to the very insecurity that they're using as a justification for military spending in the first place? And I think it's important to, really look at the empirical evidence. And it's a fact that ever increasing military spending has not meant more peace. To the contrary, between 2010 and 2020, conflicts have almost doubled from 30 in 2010 to 56 in 2020. So I think we really have to ask ourselves if we are promoting peace when we are spending ever more extortion sums on the military. And so what would it actually mean, if states committed to reducing their military spending? And based on what we've heard today, it would mean that there would be less emissions, there would be less energy and resource demands, there would be no more arms races, and there would be more resources available to advance real safety and security for humans and the planet. And there actually have been really great and concrete proposals on how such reduction in military spending could actually look like. One example is the Peace Dividend Campaign, which was launched in 2020 by over 50 Nobel Prize laureates, not just peace laureates. And the campaign proposed to reduce military spending by 2% per year in all countries. And the 2% cuts over 5 years, starting in 2025, would liberate $1.3 trillion and could be used for issues such as climate mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, etc. And again, I'm just going to share the link of that initiative in a chat in case it's of interest to you. There's another proposal by the organization Tipping Point North-South called the 5% proposal. Next slide, please. The 5% proposal is a two-part formula that halves global military spending over 10 years, while those savings, with those savings being redirected to human and planetary needs, and implements a 5% threshold formula designed to rein back military spending thereafter. And this proposal has been developed through lessons learned on campaigns such as debt, trade, and tax. And so what this means is that decade-long annual absolute cuts of 5% among the top 20 military spenders would equate to a 10-year compound cut of 40% for both military expenditure as well as carbon emissions. So just a 5% cut in military spending for 10 years would lead to a 40% cut in carbon emissions. Because of time constraints, I can't go further into these two proposals, but I did want to take the time to demonstrate that, concrete and tangible proposals have been made in the past, and we could build on those and amplify those further. Finally, I'd also like to stress that our calls for demilitarization are really not that radical. For example, a group of states such as the Non-Aligned Movement, which is a group of states of a group of 100 states, as well as many individual countries such as Bolivia, Brazil, Burkina Faso, Colombia, Costa Rica, Czech Republic, Guyana, Honduras, Mexico, Nepal, Solomon Islands, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, Trinidad and Tobago, and Venezuela, amongst others, have criticized the high levels of military spending in both this year's UN General Assembly general debate, as well as the first committee on disarmament and international security, which is currently underway in New York. And several of those countries have highlighted the incongruity of paying for war while the world burns. Also, the UN Secretary General himself continues to call for the reduction of military spending, and even the ICCP has said that the reduction of military spending, as well as the resolution of conflicts within and between countries, would free up much needed resources for the implementation of the SDGs. And next slide, please, and final slide. I want to leave you with an extract from a statement by Liechtenstein, delivered to the UN First Committee just 2 days ago, where Liechtenstein reiterated Wilf's mentioned Wilf's work and reiterated our calls for demilitarization. And it goes as follows. Military spending comes at a high opportunity cost. For example, for the mitigation of climate change, the most existential threat to human security. Warfare itself negatively affects the environment, contributes to pollution and biodiversity loss. And militarization remains a major impediment to gender equality, including through the disproportionate effect of armed conflicts on women and girls, their limited access to education and economic opportunities, as well as by nourishing patriarchal systems with weapons as expression of harmful masculinity and dominance. We applaud the important work of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and echo its founder, Jane Addams, the second woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, who said that true peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. I will leave it here, and I thank you and look forward to the discussion and to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this input. I forgot to mention, Catherine is the Environment Advisor at the International Secretariat of WILF. Thank you so much for this input. And without further ado, I want to hand over to Edwig. Edwig is the alternate regional representative for WILF Africa. She has been engaged in humanitarian disarmament advocacy from 2018 to date. And she has a passion in working in grassroots communities, raising awareness on climate change and public policies to ensure the meaningful participation of marginalized groups in policy development and implementation. She will now continue with an input on the nexus of conflict and militarism and the ecological crisis within Zimbabwe. Edwig, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So for my presentation, basically, I'm going to look at, firstly, the effects of the climate crisis at local level. So firstly, I must emphasize that water scarcity is the first challenge that most grassroots, not just grassroots, but even in urban areas, that is being felt. And water scarcity is increasing the vulnerability of women and girls. And in most rural areas, I'm sure we all know that in Africa, most rural areas, they rely on natural water sources. And as a result of the climate crisis, most of the natural water sources are drying up, which is leading to human-wildlife conflicts, because animals are also coming for the few available water resources. And then this is leading to a lot of attacks on particularly women and girls, because in grassroots communities, it is basically the duty of women and girls to be fetching water and to ensure that there is enough water within the households. And then the other challenge that we are facing is food insecurity. And as a result of food insecurity, we are experiencing that most child or girls are getting married. And this is leading to a lot of death as children are dying while giving birth, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds. it's very common to read about those stories in the newspapers, and it's really saddening. And if you try to inquire what is contributing to these child marriages, in most cases it's because of food insecurity and poverty that is being caused by the climate crisis. And then you also realize that in most communities, conflicts over the few available resources are very, very common. And due to the failure of rain-fed agriculture, you realize that most communities are now choosing or artisanal mining as an alternative livelihood. And in artisanal mining, you realize that conflicts or violent conflicts are the order of the day, and a lot of people are dying in the gold-rich areas. And one thing that I also wanted to emphasize is Zimbabwe is an agro-based economy, and most communities do not have the advanced technologies for smart agriculture, for irrigation, and these communities are failing to adapt meaningfully to the climate crisis due to the lack of financial resources. Like I indicated, the smart agriculture technologies and irrigation, you name it. And then this is people to South Africa, to Botswana, and I'm sure you're all aware of the xenophobic attacks that are happening in South Africa. And most South Africans are arguing that Zimbabweans are coming here, they're taking our jobs, they should go back to their countries. While we have people from most rural areas in Zimbabwe are also running away from the country because of the climate crisis, agriculture. They used to rely more on agriculture, but these days it's no longer viable. So most people think that, okay, fine, maybe if I go to South Africa, maybe if I go to Botswana, I'll be able to look after my family, which is also contributing to, interstate conflicts between, South Africa, Botswana, and it's just a challenge because most of these countries are complaining that these people are supposed to be going back to their countries. Why? Because they are also being affected by the effects of climate change in their own countries. Yet we are also flooding their countries. So that's also a challenge that is being faced. So I'm just trying to explain that the crisis that we are facing is not only just for Zimbabwe, but it's also, affecting the region, which is also a challenge to say that the countries that are also trying to manage their own crisis, and then we are also failing to manage our own crisis. And then at the end of the day, we are ending up saturating their own economies, which is a challenge. And then while we are at this, we are arguing that the climate crisis is contributing to conflicts at local level and at regional level. And communities do not have the resources to actually adapt to the climate crisis, to adapt, not just adapting, but adapting meaningfully. Because when you're talking about meaningful adaptation, we're looking at solutions that are practical and solutions that have got lasting, results. We come back to discuss how militarism is also fitting into this whole narrative. Michelle was just presenting to us, and in her presentation, she indicated that almost $2.24 trillion it was spent in 2022 on militarism, and then you tend to wonder that about 100 billion was pledged to deal with the climate crisis. 2.24 trillion dollars is compared to 100 billion. I'm sure you realize that the attention that is being given to the climate crisis, it's actually sickening, because you find that world powers have got so much power, so much money to spend on the military industries, yet they don't have money to spend on peaceful solutions. Because the moment that we are dealing with the climate crisis and coming up with practical adaptation solutions, we are actually building peace. But then you realize that the world right now is not prepared to investing in peace, but they are prepared in investing in war and conflict, which is also a challenge, because militarism will only contribute to more violent conflicts. And especially even if you look at how much is being spent by African countries on militarism, and you realize that these are the same countries that are also failing to come up with practical solutions to the climate crisis, but they can afford to buy arms. which means that we are not going anywhere for as long as countries are still choosing to invest more in militarism and forgetting the actual issues that are contributing to conflict at grassroots level, then we are actually not going anywhere. And then you also notice that the military industries is also contributing more to greenhouse gas emissions. And then we are saying that if we invest more on the climate crisis, which means that we will ensure that there is a reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions, of which that is the end game. That is what we all want to see. So it's very difficult for us to see the change that we want to see if more attention is being given to the military industries. Hence, I believe that solutions to the climate crisis must include demilitarization. The world must invest in peace and not in war. As long as the military industries are striving, we can never beat the climate crisis. And as long as the climate crisis has not been attended to, the world will continue to plunge into more devastating wars, and no one is safe and no one is secure, because there's that argument to say, like what Catherine was saying, that there are other countries that argue that militarism is the only way that they can secure themselves from this insecure world. But no one is safe from militarism, and no one is safe from the new arms technologies and from these from all this military spending that is happening. But it also increases the rate of our insecurities. Everyone is also affected by that, and we can also, right now there's a war in Ukraine, and I'm sure that everyone is feeling the impact of the war that is in Ukraine. We Africans are feeling we are feeling the impacts. All the European countries are feeling the impact. So no one is safe and no one is secure. So our demands are simple. Solutions to the climate crisis must include demilitarization, because without demilitarization, we cannot achieve climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edwig, and thank you so much for your input. And I'm sure there's probably might be questions later on as well to discuss a little bit more in detail. And because of the time constraints, I want to hand over straight away to Ola, who is a Yemeni activist and researcher. She's the founder and the chairperson of Peace Environment for Development, a civil society organization working on peace building and climate change. She has briefed the UN Security Council on youth peace and security and a youth peace and security agenda. And she's been working furthermore on YPS and also the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Thank you so much for being here, Ola. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I know I don't have much time, so I'm going to try to be as short as possible. My colleague has mentioned a lot of horrible facts about military, the finance of military, and all those effects of military on the whole planet and on the environment, and also on the lives of people. So I'm not going to mention all these numbers again, but I'm going to mention something else. It is the reality of the country. I'm living in Yemen. I have been living here since I was born. I also have lived during the war. The war in Yemen started in 2015. During the war, I have almost seen all the kinds of weapons in the country. It was horrible. 9 years of war resulted in very dangerous things. First, we have the humanitarian crisis. As you know, Yemen is facing the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, with millions of people needs food security, water security, and also millions of IDPs. But this is also not, this is not the end. The military and the war is still on in the country. People are still fighting till now. It is just like few kilometers away from my home. This military and militarization and the war has a lot of effects on the lives of people. Not just that, it also has a lot of influence on the environment, and that causes a lot of dangerous diseases which have spread among the people and killed millions of people living in Yemen. I have just talked about the situation or the current situation in Yemen, but can we just try to imagine how the future of going is going to be with the militarization that we are having right now. If it continues the same way, can you imagine in 10 years, for example, if the war didn't stop? Yemen is one of the most affected countries by the climate change, and the effects are going to be much worse if the war is still on. People here right now in Yemen are facing a lot of issues because a lot of schools have been destroyed, for example. So a lot of children are studying in one school. Like, it is so crowded. Sometimes there are over 50 students in one classroom. And imagine how hard it is with the high temperature we are facing, and especially when it is a school near the front lines, the temperature is higher due to the use of the weapons there. So in the near future, a lot of schools are going to be, not having a lot of children, and many of them are going to escape schools because it is not a good environment anymore for them to study. Can you imagine if the war is still on? The situation of the hospitals, for example, many hospitals have been destroyed. A lot of diseases have just appeared because of the climate change in Yemen. I told you before that the environment was affected by the war, and many diseases appear in the country. The hospitals right now are not that qualified to manage the situation, and can you imagine how worse it's going to happen to be if the situations just continue the same way? I don't know if you know that, but Yemen is also an agriculture country. We depend on agriculture. Actually, about 50% of the income of people is based on agriculture, and they are now threatening because of climate change and because of the war. Many of these agriculture areas are going to be affected by the drought because of the less of the lack of water in Yemen, and also because of the rain. We have also some really and crucial impact of the climate change on the agriculture areas and agricultural lands. It is because of the floods also. As you also know, Yemeni people, like 2/3 of the Yemeni people, are living in rural areas, and those people are going to be badly affected by the floods because it is a mountainous area. So a lot of people are living there. It is so dangerous when there are floods. Many of their houses, many streets are going to be destroyed, are going to be closed. It is very hard for us right now also to travel from one area to other because of the siege in the country and the close of the main streets. So we are using usually some other streets to go on roads to go from one place to another, and those are also going to be closed because of the effects of climate change. So what the militarization is doing or affecting the country right now and what we are facing currently might be just nothing to what are we going to face in the near future because of climate change. So we can never achieve a real peace if we are not focusing on everything. We cannot build peace in Yemen just by, working on these activities related to peace if we are not going to end militarization in the country, because we cannot focus on the other related things to the peace building if not working on the militarization first. So we are also trying to do that. We are facing a lot of issues in Yemen. It's not that easy to work on demilitarization, especially if you're living in a state of a conflict. Like now we are not having one government. It is not just one military or just two conflict parties. They are many. So it's very hard to manage what is going on. A lot of money is spent on the militarization while people are dying of hunger. We are not safe as an activist working in Yemen. We're not safe at all, especially when we are talking about military. We cannot work on accountability campaigns, for example, asking them to stop the war, to stop the spending on military, or to focus on other things related to people or even peace building, as we don't have any kind of protection as activists living in Yemen. But we are trying our best, like working on some activities related to kind of working on some kinds related to, for example, negotiation between the conflict parties. So I know we don't have enough time, so I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Ola, for providing this overview of the situation in Yemen. And yeah, it's just heartbreaking to hear from you. And we send you all of our love and solidarity. But yeah, thank you for all the work that you're doing in what is really difficult circumstances, and really, you know, working at the intersections of militarization and armed conflict and the impact of the climate crisis is, yeah, must be so hard. And yeah, thank you so much to you and Edwig for sharing your analysis and experience. So what I would like to do now for the next 10 minutes is see if any of the participants have any questions. Questions or comments. You can either raise your hand or write the comment or question in the chat. I'll just give it a few moments for folks to collect their thoughts and see if there's any questions. Otherwise, oh yeah, okay, great. I've got one hand up. Ashwini, please, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm quite new to this space here, and I was trying to look actually if we have some colleagues from the sort of the usual environmental climate movements on this call. So I must say I'm very enlightened and educated about this topic more than before. And the only place I discovered about militarization and the link to climate change was, one, because we work with Ukrainian colleagues, and two, because at the last COP, I found a very pink sticker saying war is not green. And I was like, bloody hell, why are we not talking about this more? So just to introduce myself, I'm working with the Global Gas and Oil Network. I come from the Pacific Islands, where it's sort of ground zero for climate change. And I also am part of Climate Action Network. I was trying to look here to see whether we had colleagues from those networks on this call, but I actually don't see them. And I see lots of new names. So Bula, nice to meet all these new people. What I wanted to say is that there are some very, very strong connections on militarization and the fossil fuel use and the funding side with the mainstream climate movement. And there is a whole campaign going on right now called End Fossil Fuels. And there are quite a few demands, but I do not think we have a demand related to militarization in there right now. So my offer would be how to see that we can link this group with those environmental groups, and to actually echo this demilitarization and peace building work into that campaign, which is about ending fossil fuel crisis, fossil fuel invented climate crisis, let's say. And I personally work on like the industry and the industry social licensing, and how the fossil fuel industry keeps surviving, because obviously for the war, for this and that, everybody keeps using fossil fuels. So I would just like to see how we can follow up on this and kind of bring in the elements around military and how much emissions they are emitting, and the finance they're chewing up from the whole sector, which means that finance is not going to other things. So many dots to connect. So just an invitation to say, let's connect. There's like too much information. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, did you want to say something else? No, okay. No, thank you so much for your reflections, and it's really great to see you on the call. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but it is something that, you know, we as WILP and other organizations interested in the intersections of militarization and the climate crisis are working on really hard, as how can we bring this topic into the more traditional climate and environment organizations. I think Michelle, my colleague, will speak a bit more to that in a bit, how we're trying to work with relevant constituencies and coalitions for COP28 and beyond on, making exactly those links: military spending, emissions, all of what you mentioned. But also just to say quickly that WILP is also part of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign. And we are also trying to bring in the peace demilitarization angle in there. But it is definitely something that often is met with a little bit of resistance. And I think there's still a lot of kind of education to do around this topic. And so it's really great to know that you're on board and your organization is on board, and hopefully we can mobilize more civil society actors to, understand this issue and then raise this issue and amplify it across all the different organizations and demands.
Maybe I can jump in here quickly as well to talk about the networking aspect before handing over to the next question. So we also definitely saw the need, right, to connect ourselves better also with the different constituencies and really to bring the topic of demilitarization on the agenda of COP and COP28. So recently during an online session, we therefore launched the Peace and Demilitarization Working Group within the Women and Gender constituency. So the Women and Gender constituency is one of the many constituencies under the UNFCCC, particularly focusing on feminist approaches and gender justice. But this is really an invitation for you all to join this working group. It's not a working group only linked to one constituency, it's cross constituencies. And anyone is invited who really want to drive and develop strategies to really bring the topic of demilitarization further under the UNFCCC. And it's really in space that we can all design ourselves. We have an email list server, and we can just post the link into the chat in a second. And feel free to join us on this journey. And then I would just hand it over to Thomas Breuer for the next question.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion and presentations. And I'm happy to hear that so many people, mainly women, I guess, in this round, are interested in the connection between environmental and issues and military spending. So that's what we really try to do from Greenpeace Germany, to really connect, especially the manic build up of military in Germany now, especially in Germany. So to connect this with social issues and with environmental issues, where definitely will be less money for future solutions. And we try to connect this with human securities. So the broader discussion, as most in the public debate is about military security, and with all the effects you just mentioned. So I'm very much interested whether where you already succeeded maybe in getting higher attention to this issue. That would be very welcome, and would be happy to continue the discussion. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you so much. It's great to know that Greenpeace Germany is working on this, and I did also read reports from Greenpeace Germany about this. So it's nice to be connected. So I think what also in terms of, because you asked what kind of reception, if there has been any uptake by higher level stakeholders, and I think that in the disarmament space, or in general in the UN General Assembly, I read the quote of Liechtenstein that really spoke to the issues that we care about, and there's other states in the New York UN spaces that really talk about human security, the issue of military spending diverting from sustainable development goals. So there is some I think there are some avenues for further advocacy there. However, what we haven't seen so far is the same countries making these same connections in the climate space, right? So we've only seen that more in which is already great, but now I think it's about how do we get a group of states together in a climate space to raise the issue, make the connections there. But I also think, well, we'll be discussing more, what the strategy will be in the working group that Michelle has mentioned for COP28. But I think another key focus of our work should also be really bringing in more civil society organizations and coalitions to really build a strong movement and build the pressure. Obviously, these things can go in parallel, but that's kind of the vision that we're trying to pursue. But of course, it's great to work with as many organizations on this as possible. And so, would love to connect. Thomas, I don't know if you want to share your email in the chat with me. That would be great, so we can connect. Thank you. And Jenny has a last question.
Okay, this is actually more an information thing. I'm in the UK, and Wilf is here as part of the organisation XR Peace, which is actually a combination of all the peace groups, who are interested, who are also in their peace activities, linking it to the military side of things, and it works very well. In fact, we had a presence at the last XR Peace events in London, and we were outside the military department. And also, just on Greenpeace, Thomas, in the UK, Greenpeace it got in touch with Wilf so that we're going to share a meeting together, which is it's the first time I've known Greenpeace do that. And that should be very interesting to see what we can what we can do together. Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for brilliant presentations.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for sharing the perspective from the UK and how the interlinkages are worked on there. That's really good to know. So I also can see there's a lot of discussion and exchange in the chat. So it's really great. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening and for sharing your thoughts and experiences in the chat. I'm really excited to continue working on this. Michelle, do you want to have the last word to close the call?
Because we only have 1 minute, but I just wanted to maybe ask Ola or Edwig if there's anything they would like to add for them to close. Ola, do you want to go first?
The most important thing that it is a continuous work that we have to do for a long time. It is not just something we talk about at once and try to work on militarization or demilitarization just within a project or specific time. Like, it is something that we have to continue working on for a long time.
Thank you so much. And Edwig?
Nothing much from me, but the call for demilitarization is not only for us in the global south, but like I said, no one is safe as long as the military industries are producing arms, and as long as there's so much military expenditure going on, we are all insecure. So we need to work hand in hand. We need to, like our mantra in Wilf is, we are stronger together. And as long as we fight with an amplified voice, I'm very sure that we'll get the result that we want to see. Yes, it cannot be a process that can be achieved in a day, but in the long run, we'll begin to see the results from our actions. That's it from me.
Thank you so much. And thank you as well from my side. There's nothing to add. Thank you all for joining, and please join the Peace and Demilitarization Working Group so that we can continue to have this conversation and really put demilitarization and sustainable peace at the agenda and address the root causes of the climate crisis. Thank you and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.